A millionaire tired of being used for his money decides to do the unthinkable. He abandons everything, money, status, mansions, and disguises himself as poor to find out if true love still exists. He wanted to know, if I have nothing, will anyone still choose me? And when he finds the answer, it comes from the last person the world would expect. The overweight housekeeper at the boarding house where he was living, a woman no one looked at twice, was the only one who saw the man behind the disguise. What was supposed to be a test became a real story, one of those that breaks our prejudices right down the middle. But did she accept his love when she discovered the truth? Wait until you hear what happened. Marcus Ashford always had everything most people spend their whole lives trying to achieve: money, prestige, fame, a powerful last name in the business world, and a wife who was on magazine covers all the time. Isabella was the type of woman who turned heads wherever she went. With that rehearsed smile, sculpted body, designer clothes, and a presence that seemed straight out of soap opera. Together, they were seen as the perfect couple. But behind the cameras, the flash, and the champagne toasts, there was an emptiness that only those who live for appearances know. The marriage was beautiful on the outside and rotten on the inside. Isabella didn't care about him as a person, and that became clearer with each new social event, each cold morning of silence. Each time she treated him like a walking trophy, nice on the shelf, but useless in the heart. The last straw came when she asked for a divorce with the same coldness as choosing a new dress at an expensive store. No drama, no tears, no hesitation. And you know what's most curious? Marcus wasn't devastated, didn't go into crisis, didn't fall into the temptation of playing the victim. In fact, what he felt was relief. The kind of relief you feel when you take off tight shoes after hours of walking. He took a deep breath, looked at himself in the mirror, and finally saw the truth he'd been ignoring for years. He was never loved for who he was, but for what he had. The money, the assets, the expensive dinners. That's what attracted people around him, including his own wife. He spent his life surrounded by people, but never felt as alone as in that marriage that was more a social contract than a union of souls. That night, standing in front of the mirror, Marcus made a decision that few would have the courage to make. He decided to search for something money could never buy: true love, not that movie romance with flowers and kisses in the rain, but something genuine, deep, that pierced through the soul. The kind of feeling that can't be bought, can't be faked, can't be negotiated. He wanted to live emotional stories, the kind you carry in your chest forever, even when time passes. And for that, he knew he needed to strip away everything that made him desirable in the world's eyes. It was time to leave the stage, turn off the spotlights, and discover if, behind the millionaire character, there was still a man capable of being loved for who he truly was. And that's when everything started to change. Because when we choose truth, life begins to show us who we really are. After the divorce, Marcus could very well have plunged back into the luxurious lifestyle he'd always known. He could have bought a new car, gone out with another younger model, taken extravagant trips just to fill the silence Isabella left. But no, he was tired. Tired of plastic smiles, friendships of convenience, looks that only sparkled when the bank account balance was a topic of conversation. The wealth, which before seemed like a blessing, now sounded like a golden prison. Marcus began to realize that everything around him was fake. The parties seemed like rehearsed little plays. The invitations, social strategies, and even the hugs came with invisible tags, self-interest included. That's when a bold idea came. What if he disappeared? If he traded luxury for anonymity? If he was just another person in the crowd and lived like an ordinary man? Would he find someone who would love him without knowing who he was? The decision seemed absurd to the few friends who still remained nearby, or rather, the acquaintances who pretended to care. But Marcus didn't ask for permission. He started with the garage, sold the luxury cars, canceled the black cards, fired the driver, and said goodbye to the staff that took care of his house like it was a 5-star hotel. Then he cut ties with his social circle, deactivated social media, canceled events, erased the digital presence that fed his public image. He assumed a new name, Mark Henderson, and rented a small room in a boarding house in a simple neighborhood in Los Angeles. No panoramic view, private elevator, or goose feather pillows. There, with the smell of soap and cheap coffee, he would begin a new journey. For the first time in decades, he would have to live with people who didn't see him as a millionaire, but just as another person. And that, for him, was liberating. It was in this setting that Marcus began to understand a truth that the rich rarely face. The real world is raw, but it's where the essence of life lives. There, nobody cared if he wore a Rolex or a knockoff watch. What mattered was respect, manners, a sincere look. He walked the streets without being noticed, without self-interested greetings, without hidden cameras. And this invisibility that might seem humiliating to others, for him was a relief. Because when no one expects anything from you, everything you offer has double value. Marcus wanted to find real stories, real people, connections that aren't measured by money, but by presence. Only what he didn't expect was to discover that, even outside the world of the rich, appearances still dictated a lot, and that even among the humble, self-interest still showed its face, just in a more disguised way. Marcus's routine changed radically. From meetings in rooms with panoramic views of the city, he went to waking up before sunrise, to the sound of distant car horns and hurried footsteps on the neighborhood sidewalks. Now, his days began at the neighborhood bakery, a simple bakery, with the smell of fresh bread and hot coffee. He got a job as an assistant, washing pans, sweeping the floor, serving customers with discreet and sincere smile. At first, it was strange. His hands, once accustomed to million-dollar contracts, now held mops and trays. But it was there, in the simplicity of that life, that Marcus began to feel a peace he never found in luxurious halls. It was as if he was finally living, no longer surviving in the shadow of expectations, but living each small moment with presence. The people around were different. They didn't wear expensive clothes, didn't speak fluent English with fancy accents, didn't know who Marcus Ashford was, and that was exactly what he wanted. Among neighbors who shared what they had, even if it was little, and co-workers who laughed at simple jokes, Marcus felt something he never felt at the top: belonging. There was no flattery, no interested pats on the back. If someone liked him, it was for his kind manner, for his daily effort, for the good morning given from the heart. He began to observe how people struggled with dignity to support their families, how they smiled even with difficulties in their wallets. It was a strength that came from the soul. And there, among those people that many would call too simple, he found what he was looking for: emotional stories that didn't fit in headlines, but filled the chest with truth. Over time, Marcus realized that humility has a bittersweet taste. It demands effort, tiredness, sacrifice, but also delivers peace, authenticity, and human warmth. His hands hurt at the end of the day. Sweat soaked his shirt. The paycheck was short. But never had his soul been so light. He learned that someone's greatness isn't in their bank account, but in the way they treat others. The lady who cleaned the sidewalk every morning, the kid who delivered bread by bike with a smile on his face, the child who offered candy to help his overweight mom pay the rent. All of them, with their real stories, taught Marcus more than any university or CEO. But as much as he was immersed in this new world, there was something he still didn't fully understand. Up to that point, no one had approached it with true emotional interest, and he was beginning to wonder, could it be that even there, among the humble, he was still invisible to the eyes of love? Despite living simply, Marcus still attracted attention, and that, he soon realized, had nothing to do with money or expensive clothes. Even wearing worn sneakers and a wrinkled shirt, there was in him a posture, a respectful and mysterious way of carrying himself, that sparked curiosity in the people around him. The women in the neighborhood, especially, began to notice. Some found the guy from the bakery so polite and elegant amusing. Others approached with shy conversations, asking where he lived before, why he always seemed so reserved. Marcus smiled, changed the subject. But deep down, he observed every gesture, every look. He wasn't there to start a new game of appearances. He wanted to see who was real. And that's when the masks once again began to fall. Because it was enough to discover that he lived in a rental and walked everywhere, for the enchantment to turn into indifference. Reality hit hard. Self-interest isn't only in millionaire circles. Even among the most humble, vanity and the desire for status were still part of the game, just on another level. There were those who said, straight up, "You're handsome, but without a secure future, it's tough." Others, when they found out he shared a bathroom with other boarding house residents, simply disappeared. Marcus felt this like silent stabs. It wasn't about pride, but about the bitter realization that people keep choosing with their eyes, not with their hearts. Even living without showing off, he was still rejected for not meeting social expectations. It was as if the label of interesting man had an expiration date. It was valid as long as there was the illusion of stability. And with each woman who walked away, Marcus understood something deeper, that maybe true love wasn't in the high palaces, nor in the humble alleys. Maybe it was hidden where no one else was looking. But it's precisely at these times that life likes to play tricks. When we think everything is lost, something or someone appears to turn the key. Marcus began to wonder if there was someone capable of seeing beyond appearance, clothes, a dress. Someone who, instead of asking what you have, would ask, who are you? He still believed that this kind of love existed, not a fairy tale, but a sincere connection. Only, after so many disappointments, he was starting to doubt. And it was at this point in the story, when he already thought his experiment would lead nowhere, that his eyes began to turn toward a silent, invisible figure who spent the whole day cleaning, cooking, and serving others without ever being seen. A woman who didn't fit the standards, but who, unknowingly, would begin to occupy the most important space in his life. She was there from the beginning, but no one saw her. Sarah was the typical person the world learns to ignore. Overweight, shy, with her face always somewhat downcast, rough hands from work, and an apron constantly stained with soap. While the boarding house residents rushed past work or stayed in the courtyard chatting, she was there, washing, sweeping, cooking, cleaning up the traces of other people's lives. No one thanked her. No one asked if she needed anything. And when they spoke to her, it was often with disdain or sarcasm. Cruel jokes about her body were thrown around with the same naturalness as requesting services. And even so, Sarah didn't lose her sweetness. She never raised her voice, never complained. She smiled with her eyes, even though the world never smiled back at her. Marcus, little by little, began to perceive the silent presence of this woman, and what was invisible began to take shape before him. At first, it was just curiosity. Marcus saw how she treated everyone with kindness, even when she was treated like nothing. He observed when she gave the best piece of bread to the street dog, or when she stayed late just to finish a task well done. No one ordered her to. She simply did it. And not out of submission, but out of conviction. It was as if Sarah had made peace with her position in the world, but without giving up her dignity. Marcus found himself thinking about her more than he'd like to admit. He began to notice small details. The way she tucked her hair behind her ear, the care with which she folded clean towels, the way her eyes sparkled when she saw children laughing. There was no vanity, no disguise. Sarah was just herself. And that was exactly what was beginning to touch deep in Marcus's heart. For the first time, he saw someone who didn't wear a mask. And that was too rare to be ignored. As the days passed, Marcus found himself drawn to a presence that didn't try to impress. Sarah didn't flirt, didn't force conversation, didn't seek attention. And maybe that's why she was so magnetic. She didn't want anything from him. And in that world where everyone always wanted something, this absence of interest was like a breeze in the desert. Marcus began to help discreetly, held a broom, took out the trash, washed dishes without her asking. She always thanked him with a shy smile, surprised that someone noticed her with kindness. And there's something silent but powerful was born: respect. Marcus came to admire this woman who carried a body that society would call ugly, but that housed a rare soul. And it was in this contrast between what the world values and what the heart recognizes that he began to wonder, is it possible to love someone no one else sees? Could this forgotten woman actually be the only one worth remembering? Life has those ironies that only those who pay attention perceive. Marcus, the man who once had the best doctors at his disposal, the best health insurance, got sick in a tiny room with damp walls and cheap sheets. A bad flu, high fever, chills. Nothing serious for someone who has someone nearby, but absolutely cruel when you're alone. He stayed 3 days unable to get out of bed, barely dragging himself to the bathroom. He waited for someone to knock on the door. Maybe one of the neighbors who used to live smiling at him, asking if he wanted company. But no one appeared. No message, no help. The silence was a harsh reminder. When you have nothing to offer, you discover who's really with you. Marcus, for the first time, felt truly vulnerable. There, with his feverish body and pride in ruins, he experienced what it was to be forgotten. At the end of the afternoon on the second day, when he already thought he couldn't even get up, someone knocked on the door. 3 soft knocks. When he opened it, half staggering, he found Sarah there, holding a bowl of hot soup and a small bag with simple medicines. "You need to rest, Mr. Mark," she said, with that small smile and worried eyes. He didn't know how she knew he was sick. Maybe she noticed his absence in the courtyard or the silence in the hallway. But it didn't matter. What mattered was that gesture. Without anyone asking, without expecting recognition, she brought what she had. And the most incredible thing, she bought the medicines with her own money he knew she didn't have to spare. None of the women who praised him for being kind showed up. No neighbor brought even a glass of water. But Sarah, the invisible and overweight woman from the boarding house, brought presents, care, and the rarest of ingredients, sincere affection. Marcus was moved in a way he couldn't explain. That hot soup did more for him than any gala dinner had ever done, because, for the first time in a long time, someone cared for him without wanting anything in return. And it's curious how true feelings don't need to shout to be profound. Sometimes, everything starts with a small gesture. Care here, a word there, that slowly infiltrates the heart until it becomes impossible to ignore. Marcus began to look at Sarah with different eyes, not with pity, nor with superficial gratitude, but like someone recognizing a jewel the world dropped on the ground. As he drank the soup, he wondered, how can someone so invisible be so essential? And deep down, he already knew that this simple woman would end up occupying a space that none of the others ever managed to reach. After that day when Sarah showed up with the soup and medicines, something changed between the two. It wasn't immediate nor dramatic. It was subtle, like when the sky changes color before nightfall. Marcus began to notice Sarah's presence with more sensitivity. She was no longer just a woman who cleaned a boarding house floor. Now she was a person he hoped to see at the end of the day. And this happened naturally, without effort, without rehearsal. They began to talk every night in the courtyard, sitting in simple plastic chairs under the dim light of the street lamp. Sarah, with her calm voice, told about her childhood, marked by poverty and rejection. She talked about her mom, who worked herself to the bone to feed the children, and her dad, who left when she was still too young to understand why. Marcus listened like someone listening to a forgotten song, and each word of hers touched him in a different way, because it wasn't just a story, it was the raw truth that came along with it. Sarah talked about the marks that life left not only on the body, but on the soul. She told how she had learned, while still young, to laugh at her own wounds to prevent others from using them against her. She said with a sad smile that she'd already been called fat useless by a rich employer, and that many times she got used to be in the back of the room, the last option, the one no one chose. But she also talked about the small joys, the smell of cake baking, the flowers that sprouted in the childhood backyard, the nights when she managed to sleep without pain. Marcus felt touched by all of that, and the most surprising thing, he felt seen. Sarah didn't want to impress him. She simply existed with truth, and he, who had already had perfect women by his side, found himself captivated by a woman the world would never put on a pedestal, a woman who didn't fit the standards, but who, somehow, fit perfectly in the empty space he'd been carrying in his chest for years. Over time, Marcus began to feel something he hadn't felt since his youth, butterflies in his stomach. It wasn't blind passion nor momentary desire. It was that deep feeling of caring about someone to the point of wanting their well-being before his own. He began to notice details that previously went unnoticed. The way she scratched her nose when she laughed, how she got embarrassed when complimented, how she discreetly fixed herself up on days when they knew they would talk. Marcus was falling in love, and not because of appearance nor because of status, but because of Sarah's soul. And when you love someone's soul, the body becomes shelter, not judgment. He understood that emotional stories aren't in soap operas or on social media, but in real encounters between people who recognize each other even without understanding why. But there was still something pending, a truth he was hiding, a secret that, sooner or later, would need to be revealed. And he knew, When that happened, everything could change. Truth has a weight we're not always ready to carry. Marcus knew he needed to be honest with Sarah, that she deserved to know the real story behind that man she was beginning to love. But admitting he had lived a lie, however nobly intentioned, wouldn't be easy. He invited her to a simple dinner, away from the lights and curious eyes, in a small neighborhood restaurant. With his heart pounding, he explained to her who he really was. Not an ordinary man named Mark Henderson, but the millionaire Marcus Ashford, owner of one of the largest construction companies in the country. The words came out heavy, loaded with fear and regret. He wanted her to understand that he never played with her feelings, that this false identity was a means to find true love, not a cruel whim. But Sarah's reaction was the opposite of what he expected. She was paralyzed, eyes full of tears that didn't fall immediately. When she finally spoke, her voice came out broken by a mixture of pain and anger. "So, all of this was a lie? You played with me to have fun with the fat girl from the boarding house." It was like a punch to Marcus's chest. He tried to explain, asked her to hear his side, to see beyond the surface, but she didn't want to hear any more. For Sarah, it wasn't just about the lie, but about the implicit contempt she felt upon discovering that her entire world was a performance. She felt used, humiliated, and betrayed. In that moment, the abyss between them seemed insurmountable. Marcus realized that, as genuine as his love was, the lie created a barrier almost impossible to tear down. The woman no one used to notice now became the center of his existence, and, ironically, she was the one who most needed space to breathe and decide. The pain of rejection was intense, and the silence that followed between them spoke louder than any words could express. Marcus kept thinking about the real love stories that surpass appearances and masks, and wondered if that relationship could resist such a heavy secret. What seemed to be a tale of transformation now took shape as a test for the authenticity of feeling. And there, between the fear of losing everything and the hope of rebuilding trust, Marcus realized that the path to true love is arduous, full of stumbles and mistakes, but also profound lessons. As Sarah walked away crying, he knew he couldn't give up, that he needed to find a way to prove that, behind the millionaire facade, there was a man capable of loving without conditions. And this search, harder than he imagined, was just beginning. After that difficult night, when Sarah left crying, Marcus felt an emptiness that not all the money in the world could fill. The silence of the mansion where he returned to live was deafening, as cold as the distance he now felt in his chest. He realized that, despite the riches and applause, his life was empty again, a luxury stage without a real audience. What really mattered had left, and only the bitter feeling of mistake that seemed irreparable remained. It was no longer a matter of status or appearance. It was a genuine desire to fix what he himself had broken. Determined not to let that story end there, Marcus began a frantic search for Sarah, who had disappeared like a shadow. He used contacts, called friends, questioned neighbors, but nothing indicated where she was. The search, exhausting and painful, became a dive into his own emotions, a true test of love. Finally, after weeks that seemed like months, a clue emerged. Sarah was working at a community daycare in a simple neighborhood in Los Angeles. There, surrounded by children, she seemed to shine with her own light, smiling with the same sweet brightness that Marcus had discovered in the boarding house courtyard. It was impossible not to notice the contrast between the life she led and the world of luxuries he had abandoned. He arrived to her, not as the millionaire, but as a man who recognized he had found something much bigger than money or fame. Seeing her surrounded by small, innocent faces, Marcus felt the weight of what he had lost, and at the same time, a silent hope. He knelt before her, in a humble gesture loaded with sincerity, and said, "I lived among mansions and lies, but it was here, with you, that I found true love." The words weren't just a plea for forgiveness, but a promise of transformation. In that moment, the complexity of real stories showed itself in all its beauty and fragility. Love, which we often believe is in appearances, in expensive clothes and glamorous parties, was there, simple and genuine, in the connection between two hearts stripped of masks. And Sarah, who had always been invisible to the world, became the light that illuminated Marcus's path. This desperate search for love wasn't just his, but everyone's who has ever felt lost, tired of illusions, and ready to find the truth. The reunion between them was the beginning of a new story, one no one could predict, but that promised to be as intense as the most emotional narratives of life. Only, like every good story, it still had surprises saved for the next chapter. Time has that incredible capacity to heal wounds and show people's true faces. After the reunion, Sarah needed months to process everything. The secret, the lie, the love she felt and the confusion it caused in her heart. Little by little, she understood that Marcus hadn't come to her to play, mock, or have fun at the expense of a fat girl from the boarding house, as she herself had said in her pain. The man behind the fortune had stripped himself of masks and titles to search for something he would never buy with money, a sincere, unpretentious, and true love. And, as difficult as the journey was, she decided to forgive him, not for him, but for herself, so she could finally live the joy she had always sought. With the blessing of that forgiveness, also came the decision to no longer hide the relationship. Marcus, previously fearful of gossip and judgment, began to introduce Sarah as his wife. The magazines, of course, delighted in the controversy. After all, the world loves stories that challenge the standard and deconstruct the ideal of beauty. Malicious comments emerged, people who doubted, who judged, who made cruel jokes about Sarah, the fat woman who won the Millionaire. But they remained firm, smiling at the criticism with the certainty of those who have already found what many search for their whole lives, a love that doesn't depend on appearances, but on essence. Marcus always said with a calm smile, "I had to pretend to be poor to discover the value of truly rich love." And it's this richness that, in the end, transforms lives. This story, so full of nuances, teaches us that the true value of people isn't in what they show the world, but in what they carry inside their chests. That love, to be lasting, needs to be woven with threads of respect, patience, kindness, and, above all, truth. The millionaire who pretended to be poor found not only love, but a powerful lesson. Sometimes you need to strip away what you have in excess to discover what really matters. And the woman society made invisible, the shy, overweight housekeeper, became the protagonist of the most emotional real love story one could tell. After all, appearances don't always reveal the depth of feelings, and emotional stories are where we least expect them. But tell me, are you willing to look beyond the facades to find what the heart truly desires? Now, stop for a moment and think. How many times have you already let yourself be carried away by appearances, by labels and superficial judgments? How many times have you failed to see the real value of people, and even of yourself, because of these illusions? The story you followed shows that true love doesn't depend on money, beauty, or social approval, but on genuine connection, respect, and empathy. So, I ask you, are you willing to look beyond the mask the world imposes? Are you ready to transform your way of loving and being loved? Change begins with that decision. And if you want to keep learning to find true relationships, overcome falsehoods, and build a life rich with meaning, subscribe here to the channel. Turn on notifications so you don't miss the next content that will help you see what really matters in life and love. After all, emotional stories like this only show us that true love can be where we least expect it, and it can be closer than you imagine. So, tell me here in the comments, what was the most impactful lesson for you in this story? I want to know your opinion.